Goes. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. On the program, we return to our All Things Africa edition, our journey across the continent, looking at the history and current affairs of each African nation. We are still in West Africa, and we now explore the epic long history of Liberia. And who better to teach us about this African nation or any African country than our returning champion, our historical guide, our history teacher, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire and frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports. Abayomi, as everyone should know by now, is a journalist, historian, and Pan-Africanist, anti-imperialist campaigner, and more. And as always, before we start, a reminder to our audience to please share widely all of 1+1's content, past and present episodes, our playlists, and help us overcome the far-right algorithms and the dominant monopoly Western corporate state media and fake leftist websites have in the social media world by sharing our content. And again, share us across social media and email, and please donate if you can to 1+1 at our PayPal. But if people are having trouble and would prefer an alternative form, then an alternative form of donation, then do get in touch with me at yurismatter@gmail.com, and I'll see if such a thing can be arranged. And again, sometimes Facebook blocks my ability to share 1+1. So again, please share widely. It helps the show immensely and is our only way of overcoming colonial, pro-imperialist, sexist, heteronormative, and racist media. And now, on to the topic at hand. Abayomi, wow. Liberia. I wasn't expecting such a long, extensive history as the one of Liberia. Like Egypt, you almost need to do a two-parts to cover this nation because it has such a long history. So
exactly.
So we may have to do that with Liberia, but let's see how far we get. So my first question is, what was Liberia like before it became the nation we know it as Liberia? Talk about this small country because it's fascinating. Because it had indigenous Black Africans, different tribes, and so forth. But then the country was founded by former enslaved Black Americans, freed African slaves from the U.S. North American part of Turtle Island, known as the U.S., came to Liberia and darkly, ironically, and tragically founded the country of Liberia, where they implemented settler colonialism and essentially the first African capitalist country. So yes, talk to us about that before we get into the different parties, the Civil War and whatnot.
Yes, it's very important to recognize that prior to the formation of the settlements, which later became the Republic of Liberia, Liberia, the territory, was part and parcel of other West African cultures and civilizations in the region. We could talk about the human settlements that were there that go back hundreds of thousands of years to the period known as the Stone Age, the various phases of the Stone Age. Later on, that territory was linked with the ancient kingdoms of Mali and Songhai during the period between perhaps the 12th century all the way up to the late 16th century when the kingdom of Songhai collapsed. The intervention of the Europeans, initially it was the Portuguese who labeled that region of West Africa as the Pepper Coast because of the spices that were available, which they were interested in, and which they set up trading forts in order to exchange goods. And the Portuguese, the British, and the French were also in the area. They were heavily involved in the Atlantic slave trade, as well as establishing forts to exploit agricultural products, gold, and other commodities that could be sold, exported, and also importing Western produced products into West Africa. So this was going on even prior to what happened during the 18th and the 19th centuries. Now, during the late 18th centuries, the British set up a committee for relief of the Black poor in the UK. They came up with the idea of expatriating African people back to the continent in West Africa. And they set up a settlement called Sierra Leone.
Which we'll
Later
cover
on,
next week, but yeah.
Yeah, later on. Now, Sierra Leone was quite interesting because it was founded largely by people who had been involved in the American War of Separation. I don't call it the War of Independence because it only benefited largely wealthy white males. But during the War of Separation, which took place between around 1775 and 1783, there was a split among the African population in the British colonies in North America. Some of them supported the American colonists who wanted to succeed from the British Empire, but the majority of people, as far as the information that is available today, the majority of Africans actually fought on the side of the British during the so-called American Revolutionary War. Now, of course, the British lost that war, and the American colonists, the 13 colonies, were able to declare their independence, and eventually they merged and became the United States of America. But the Africans who were involved in the American War of Separation, after the war, many of them were allowed to migrate to Nova Scotia in Canada. And they were able to set up settlements there. This is during the late part of the 18th century. There were others who were in the Northeast, and after the American War of Independence, slavery was abolished in some of the states, particularly those in the Northeast. So you had growing numbers of Africans who were non-enslaved. They were considered free. Even though they were considered free, they still suffered national discrimination and exploitation and oppression. So it became the question, what are you going to do? You're no longer a slave, but at the same time, you're facing discrimination and exploitation inside the newly formed United States of America. So as I mentioned, the British set up this colony known as Sierra Leone to repatriate people from England who were not doing well financially and socially. Also, there were people who were known as the Maroons in Jamaica who had resisted British colonialism on the island. They fought the British, and they reached a settlement where a number of their people were allowed to leave. Some went to Nova Scotia and others went to Sierra Leone. So in the United States, with the growing numbers of free Africans, they began to resist the discrimination and the national oppression. Even in the Northeast, for example, in Philadelphia, there was the formation of what was known as the Free Africa Society. This was during the late 1780s and early 1790s. Later, there was a formation of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. The AME Church was also linked. Some of the same people that founded the Free Africa Society were also founders of the AME Church. The AME Church was founded as a separatist movement from the standpoint that people like Absalom Jones and others who were involved in the Free Africa Society were members of the Methodist Church, but they were being discriminated and segregated inside the church. So they broke off and formed their own church. And for many years, this was considered the first independent Black church in the United States. But now, of course, we know that in the Southeast, in places such as Georgia, Florida and South Carolina, there was the formation of the first African Baptist church. And this was during the late 18th century and the early 19th century. So you had the breaking away from the white-dominated churches where African people formed their own independent churches. But this was also political because they were trying to survive in a society which was based upon racism, national oppression, and color discrimination. Now, in 1800, there was a plot that was uncovered in the state of Virginia, which was the first British colony in North America. That colony began to import enslaved Africans beginning in 1619. The first 20 came from Angola. And during the whole period of the 17th and the 18th century, there were slave revolts, there was resistance. People ran away. So in 1800, a man named Gabriel in Richmond, Virginia, was arrested and charged with planning a slave insurrection in Virginia. And this shook up the whites considerably. So as a result of that, they began to debate, what do we do with these Africans who are no longer slaves? Even the ones who are slaves are becoming more and more discontent, more and more rebellious and subjected to violence, and therefore they were rebelling against their containment and their exploitation. So the whole debate started, what do we do, with these excess Africans? So they came up with an idea of colonization, and the American Colonization Society was formed around 1816.
American Colonization Society.
Yeah, the ACS, the American Colonization Society. And supposedly they were people who were concerned, about what these Africans were going to be doing once they were no longer slaves. Now, the number of free Africans grew from about 60,000 at the time of the breaking away of the 13 colonies from Britain up until the early decades of the 19th century, around 1810, 1820, where there were hundreds of thousands of so-called free Africans. So they wanted to get rid of these people because they could start organizing. They could really be a serious problem for the white-dominated society, whether it was colonial and later antebellum. Antebellum connotes the period of enslavement beyond the United States becoming an independent state. So they formed the American Colonization Society. They started looking for land. They eventually found some land in West Africa, and they started to export people. Now, some Africans supported this idea. For example, Paul Cuffey, who was a seaman from Boston, took about 38 people to the area known as Sierra Leone to resettle them because of the racism and discrimination that they were subjected to inside the United States. But he passed away after making one trip. But this started a whole pattern. And then beginning around 1822, they started sending more and more Africans from the United States to the area that later became Liberia. And there were several settlements that existed there. And eventually by 1847, they were able to merge all these different settlements and form the Republic of Liberia with its own constitution. They declared their independence, interestingly enough, in 1847. But strangely enough, even though the U.S. set up this outpost, it was named after James Monroe, who's a former U.S. president, the capital of Monrovia. The United States would not recognize Liberia as an independent state for another 15 years. Even though it was formed in 1847, the British were the first European country to recognize the Republic of Liberia. The United States would not recognize them until the Civil War. And the only reason they did that was, of course, to win support on the part of Africans in the United States to join the Union Army. And they also recognized Haiti during this same time period. They did not recognize Haiti between 1804 all the way up to 1862. So it was the rebellion of the plans for a rebellion led by Gabriel and Richmond in 1800. Later, there were other, the Denmark Vesey or Telemachus rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina. It was a threat of a rebellion there. It was uncovered. There was a trial held. People were executed. Dozens of people were executed as a result of that uncovering of that plot. Then in 1831, of course, you had the Nat Turner Rebellion, which shook up the entire slave system, because Nat Turner was a minister. He was a trusted slave. He was allowed to travel to different plantations to preach. All the while, he was organizing his people to engage in a slave rebellion. That occurred in 1831. So all these things were going on, and it was causing panic among the planners. And even in areas where they had abolished slavery, they were still concerned about what to do with these Africans. They didn't want to integrate them into the mainstream of society, but at the same time, they did not want to have them enslaved either, because you had this transition from an agriculturally based economy to one based on greater industrialization. So in 1847, Liberia was set up. They had a series of governments going all the way up to World War I. And during World War I, of course,
Actually,
there was go ahead.
Actually, sorry to interrupt, but I think that's actually a perfect segue to my second question. So Liberia is set up. This is where they dump freed African slaves, and yet you and yet unlike Haiti, which is interesting to
Yeah,
compare
it is.
to compare and contrast the two, and yet unlike Haiti, which was a land of freed black slaves, a land of free black slaves which abolished slavery and arguably, all the stuff that the French Revolution was about liberty, equality,
Exactly.
fraternity. Hence why they were called the Black Jacobins. So that was Haiti. Of course, it all gets ruined because of French economic terrorism and the global white supremacy system. So we know that. Liberia, however, on the other hand, is founded as basically the first modern African capitalist thing, and the very settler colonialism and the slaveocracy that these freed black slaves ran away from, fled from, immigrated from, they implemented that same system on Liberia, correct?
Yeah, that was the contradiction. And the problem was that the people that were sent there were not given adequate resources. Many of them died as a result of malaria and other tropical diseases. And eventually, what happened was that the French and the British began to encroach more and more of the territory that had been given to them by the United States. So it was a conflict between the British, the French, as well as the Americo-Liberians. So what happened was that eventually the British and the French encroached on more territory. This of course, drove the new nation of Liberia further and further into debt and dependency. Then during World War I, there was a problem with Germany. The Germans actually attempted to take control of Liberia during the early phase of World War I. They actually bombed the capital city of Monrovia. and the British had to intervene to repel the German naval intervention in Liberia. So this happened during World War One.
Wow.
So a lot of people are not aware of this conflict during World War One. We have to go back and remember that the Berlin Conference, West Africa Conference in 1884 and 1885, carved up the continent. But World War One, of course, clearly showed that that agreement in Berlin in 1884 and early 1885 was not adequate. They went to war several decades later, and millions of people died during World War One. And even in Africa, there was conflict. We talked about before the efforts on the part of the Europeans, the British, as well as the French, to recruit Africans into their military forces during World War One. In Nyasaland, in southern Africa, which is today Malawi, a minister by the name of Chilimwe, John Chilimwe, actually led a rebellion in 1915 to resist the conscription of the people of Nyasaland into the British Army to fight on their behalf during World War One. So yes, this is what happened in Liberia. And then after the war was over, and of course, Germany was put in a very disadvantageous position. And you had the Paris treaties of Versailles, the Versailles Treaty of Versailles, which further damaged the status of Germany. But after the war, the British, of course, became more and more dominant in Liberia. So what happened was that they sunk further and further into debt. So the fact that they had rubber, and this coincided with the growth of the US industrial age, the rise of the automobile industry, which required rubber for tires and other parts on the car. So yes, there was a huge demand for rubber. Liberia had plenty of it, and Firestone Rubber Corporation, which was closely linked with the Ford Motor Company, wound up becoming dominant in Liberia, and they remained dominant for decades, to the point that they even pretty much took over the operations of the Liberian government, extending credit and at the same time having a tremendous influence on the politics of that West African state. So it was largely isolated, the nation of Liberia. Sierra Leone, even though it was a British outpost, was not independent. Liberia was independent, but no other country other than Abyssinia, known as Ethiopia as well, were considered independent.
Which also has its own severe limitations because
It does.
a feudal society. So that's so
Exactly.
that's so
Yeah.
so so that's fascinating. So let's get into
The
what
1920s, yeah, was dominated heavily by Firestone Rubber Corporation. During World War II, the United States did invest money in Liberia as an outpost for their military forces during World War II, and they built up some of the infrastructure inside the country. Later, building an international airport and other forms of infrastructure inside of Liberia. Today, the country has about 5.5 million people. But in terms of the conflict between the Americo-Liberians and the so-called indigenous African groups, for example, the Mandi-speaking people, the Kru, and others, this was a reality of the situation there. But it did not improve the overall economy of Liberia.
before we get that, okay, so
Mhm.
okay, so let's definitely get into the history. Starting with this. Now, we won't talk about every single leader, but let's definitely
Mhm.
talk about the different periods and the different political parties have dominated Liberia. So talk to us about Liberia's history from January the 3rd, 1848 to January 3rd, 1870, when the ruling party that set the socio-economic agenda was the Republican Party. How do you assess this party's politics? Because on Wikipedia, they're described as being center left, but the ideology is one of decentralization, classical liberalism. And remember, folks, a liberal democracy, a central tenet is the free market and progressivism. What's your response before we talk about the true Whig Party?
Yeah, well, the whole notion of laissez-faire capitalism and free market capitalism did not help the majority of the people in Liberia at all. They suffered from immense poverty and underdevelopment. And that was the situation for many, many decades. Now, they did have elite elements among the ethnic groups that were there prior to the intervention of the Americo-Liberians. And many of the Americo-Liberians had been enslaved, had been freed or manumitted, and a lot of them came from places like Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Virginia, and so forth, where African culture still remained extremely strong. But at the same time, the gap between the capturing of Africans on the continent, bringing them into the United States and also to the Caribbean. We have to also mention there were people from the Caribbean who also migrated to Liberia. William Edmond Blyden, was a well-known intellectual writer, religious figure who wrote books, who lectured at the university in Liberia, and he was originally from the Caribbean, the Virgin Islands. So yeah, there were people from both the Caribbean and from the United States who went there. They set up their own religious institutions, schools. But as I said, a lot of those people, initial groups of them died because they were not equipped to deal with the tropical conditions inside the country. And that is what happened. Now, one key figure I think is notable for the period prior to World War II, and that is the Princess Fatima Massaquoi. She was a very interesting figure. Her father was a Liberian diplomat to Germany. And this was during the 1920s, prior to the rise of the Third Reich. So he had enough resources. She was educated in an English-speaking school. She spoke English along with French and other languages, as well as traditional African languages, the VAI language, V-A-I. And then she was sent to school in the United States, to historically Black college, Fisk University, and also Lane College, both of which are in Tennessee. And she became a scholar and worked at Fisk University, teaching not only foreign languages, because she was fluent in German as well as French, but she also taught traditional African and European folk dancing. And she wrote an autobiography, Princess Fatima, while she was at Fisk University. And there was a conflict that erupted between one of her professors and her over control of this written document. At some point, they said they were going to edit it. This is the people at Fisk University. And eventually it was not given back to her. And she had to actually go to court and sued Mark Watkins. He was a professor and a linguist and anthropologist. I think it was perhaps one of the first academically trained anthropologists in the United States during that time period. Anyway, during the 1920s, she was in the United States at Fisk University, and she actually sued the Fisk University and won a favorable ruling to get her book back. The judge also ruled that they could not publish the book under no circumstances or profit from it. So eventually she left Fisk University and went to school in Boston. And eventually the book was published. And Princess Fatima lived for many, many years after that. So I thought that was a very interesting episode in regard to Liberian history, where you had somebody who came from a traditional African ethnic group whose father was a diplomat, and she was sent to school here in the United States, attended Fisk University and Lane College. These are Black colleges in Tennessee, and ran into problems with some of the people in the administration there. Still overcame that and made a tremendous contribution, in terms of conveying traditional African culture to a broader African American as well as broader American audience during that particular time period.
Now, talk to us about when the talk to us about when the rise of the true Whig party came to power in Liberia. Now, this was a party that was influenced by the political philosophy of the Whig Party of the U.S. Reading about them on Wikipedia, it says the ideology of the party is Black conservatism, a more centralized state and protectionism, but they were actually big advocates of economic liberalism during the 1940s, and they were obscenely anti-communism, anti-left when under the leadership of William Tubman. And Wikipedia also said that although the party favored protectionism in its early years, it later pursued deregulation, free market, and economically liberal policies known as the Porte Ouverte, open door, under Tubman to attract investment and stimulate growth. Now, its first leader lasted only a year, Edward James Roy. What's his legacy? Why was he deposed? And then talk to us about when the party was restored back to power and governed for 58 days under the leadership of James Skirving Smith. And then the Republican Party won elections back to back, 1872 to 1878. And when the true Whigs came back in office in 1878 to July 3rd, 1978, talk about this period of Liberia and the overall legacy, socioeconomic wise, for the majority of poor working class Liberians that the mostly true Whig leaders left behind.
Yeah, well, the problem with Liberia was that the economic difficulties that the people faced when they migrated there, there were problems with underdevelopment, with tropical diseases, and how do you build a society on that basis? And then there were problems with some of the indigenous groups who felt they were being encroached upon by the Americo-Liberians and the people they were collaborating with, meaning the British and the French. So that had a lot to do with the political instability during the latter part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s. But that political instability continued well into the 20th century.
Yes. So
the
then,
late 20th century, even. Yeah.
yeah. So then, talk about moments. So then, talk about when the true Whig Party was in office, 1878 to July 3rd, 1978. So there's instability there. But then, how do you assess the time in office and the socioeconomic legacy of true Whig leader of Liberia and leader of Liberia, William Tolbert, who took office July 3rd, 1971 till April 12th, 1980, where he was, I believe, also murdered and assassinated. Talk about the conditions that led to his murder, and then talk to us about the right-leaning, far-right successor he had in the form of Samuel Doe of the National Democratic Party, and how do you assess his legacy? And his time in office also ended in assassination, and he was in office from July 6th, 1986 to September 9th, 1990.
Yes. As I mentioned, Liberia, after the 1920s, pretty much became a neo-colony of the United States due to the role of Firestone rubber. This caused a lot of instability and impoverishment of the people. Then, of course, you had the influence of the Firestone Rubber Corporation and the U.S. government overall um, had a heavy influence on Liberia. So Talbert, who was executed in 1980, but before him, the president during that particular time period also had very close ties to the United States. And at the same time, though, people, for example, like the first wife of the Honorable Marcus Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey was her name.
Yeah.
She spent a considerable amount of time in Liberia and was very good friends with the Liberian government at that particular time period. Also, they supported the independence movements that were taking place in other parts of Africa. For example, the Gold Coast, which was the independence struggle was led by the Convention People's Party of Kwame Nkrumah, and they had very good relations with Nkrumah and the CPP, which eventually became Ghana after 1957. So at the same time, even though these contradictions existed, they still had open door policy to a lot of progressive African Americans during the post World War II period.
And then for 3 years,
that was under Tubman.
Yes.
Yeah, Tubman. Yeah.
And then for 3 years, Liberia was under the rule of Amo Sawyer of the Liberian People's Party. He was part of an interim government known as the President of the Interim Government of National Unity, and he was in office from September 9th, 1990 to March the 7th, 1994. His party, according to Wikipedia, was a pan-Africanist leftist party that believed in democratic socialism. He and his party were members of the Movement for Justice in Africa, which is a big left-wing, soft left-leaning organization. How do you assess his legacy compared to all of the leaders and their movements before? I'm very curious.
Yeah, MOJA, the Movement for Justice in Africa, got a lot of attention during the late 1970s, the early 1980s as a progressive revolutionary democratic movement in Liberia. But it was not able to ward off the other contradictions that were looming during that particular time period of the 1980s. And of course, Talbert's assassination in 1980 was very disturbing for a lot of people in the West Africa region. Because they had not seen that type of political violence being carried out in Liberia in terms of its history. Been a lot of instability, a lot of corruption, a lot of domination by Firestone Rubber Company and other U.S. firms. But that coup really upset a lot of people.
And actually, that's a perfect segue to this. It's time to talk about the bloody, the ghoulish, the obscene, real-life horror movie and snuff film that was the first Liberian Civil War. Tell us about how this first in a long chapter, which was just horrific African tribal sectarian warfare civil war, broke out, and how do you assess the legacy, if there's any to speak of the three leaders, the three leaders of the Western recognized government during this time, all independents. That's David D. Copamore. Apologies if I'm butchering his name. March 7, 1994 to September 1st, 1995. Wilton G. Senkawulu, September the 1st, 1995 to September 3rd, 1996. And then Ruth Perry, September 3rd, 1996 to August 2nd, 1997. So yes, talk to us about the Civil War and what did the U.S. and its allies, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, and NATO nations, who did they support and why? Or were they neutral? But when we say neutral, we mean supplying all sides because it works out either way for the West when instability of an African nation and the continent in general happens. So I'm very curious your response.
Yes, well, on April 12th of 1980, that's when Talbot was overthrown and assassinated. I believe members of his family were also killed during that, and leading figures within the Liberian government. He was overthrown by a man named Samuel Doe, and he was someone who was in the military, and he tried on several occasions to set up governments during that time period, um, all during the 1980s, and eventually in 1990, I believe, no, December of 1989, he himself fell victim to a coup d'etat, was executed, and as a result of that, there were serious problems inside the country. Charles Taylor, who became de facto leader during that particular time period, tried to consolidate Liberia, but they fractured. The National Patriotic Front of Liberia began to fracture as well. And then, of course, the eruption of another insurgency in neighboring Sierra Leone, led by a man named Foday Sanko.
Actually,
okay.
Abayomi, but before talking about that, talk a bit more about the Civil War and who did the West support or not support, and when the West wasn't supporting one side over the other, was that neutrality a fake neutrality because the West was supporting multiple sides because it benefits the West when when an African country or an entire region is very unstable, correct?
Yeah, I believe that they were concerned about their economic interests inside of Liberia. So they wanted stability, but there was no stability. Very limited stability was found during the 1980s. And by 1989, of course, that's when the insurgency began. And it lasted for many years. The war, internal conflict with Charles Taylor. There was Prince Johnson, was another faction that broke off from the NPFL. And of course, this was related to what was happening in neighboring Sierra Leone, where this group called the Revolutionary United Front also began their insurgency inside the country. And that lasted for several years as well. It would take a regional force, the Economic Community of West African States, that sent in their forces into Sierra Leone and later into Liberia, which brought about the conclusion of the Civil War. And that didn't occur until the early part of the 2000s, in fact.
Charles Taylor, president of Liberia from August the 2nd, 1997 to August 11, 2003. His political armed, his party, politically armed group, and yeah, he was leader of this armed political group, which later became a political party, the National Patriotic Party. Now you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to say that I would say that the party is very far right. And very much practiced narrow tribalism and advanced neo-patrimonialism. So a government of cronyism, clientelism, legalized bribery, and kleptocracy. But one, of course, has to be very careful when it's applied to an African context because it's often used in a very racist manner. Now, Taylor, Africa has had many repugnant leaders: Idi Amin, Paul Kagame, Paul Biya, who won his re-election. The too many to count and name Nigeria far-right military junta, but the single most obscene brute was Sani Abacha, Hastings Bonza, Youri Museveni, and numerous other African bootlickers to Western imperialism and savage tribal sectarians. Of course, I listed the mostly far-right folks. Others, others would include the Derg and very far left leaders who later governed to the right. But Charles Taylor, you have to put in the rogues gallery of people who contributed very little to the very people they claimed they wanted to address legitimate grievances of. So talk to us about Charles Taylor and the second Liberian Civil War and whom the Western imperialist alliances supported and why. And how do you assess so how do you assess Charles Taylor's legacy and the Second Liberian Civil War. And also important to add, when when it was covered by the international Western corporate press and Western state press and others, the Second Liberian Civil War, of course, the world was shown the horrendous use of child soldiers, the use of conflict diamonds, and just so much unimaginable carnage that both the rebels and the government forces use. So again, very curious your assessment of Charles Taylor and what led to his being ousted and resigning in August 11th, 2003.
Yeah, Charles Taylor was a warlord, so to speak, and I believe he was considered a miracle Liberian as well. Samuel Doe was supposed to have been the first head of state who was non-American Liberian in Liberia. Yeah, but Taylor's legacy, some thought he could stabilize the situation in Liberia during the late 1990s, up until the early 2000s, but it did not happen. There was, of course, fighting that continued from various rebel groups during this time period. And eventually he agreed, Charles Taylor, as a result of regional and United Nations mediation, to leave the country and go to neighboring Nigeria. And that's what happened. But the war was devastating, and it spilled over, as I mentioned, into Sierra Leone. So it was a horrible situation that went on there particularly during the 1990s in Liberia, as well as in Sierra Leone.
And of course, Charles Taylor. Well, he's not depicted by name, but anybody who has seen the Hollywood movie with Nicolas Cage, Lord of War, which is based on the very dodgy arms dealer whose name I'm blanking out on, but but the British actor who depicts the leader of Liberia, it's very obvious that they're depicting Charles Taylor and the unbelievable atrocities that the man
Yes.
committed. So it's
Mhm.
so Charles Taylor. So not much of a legacy, clearly,
Mhm.
that we can praise of. I'm curious. Well, yes. And what's your assessment of his successor from the same party, Moses Blah, who was in power August 11th, 2003 to October 14th, 2003?
Um, just trying to stabilize the state after the departure of Charles Taylor, which was negotiated. You know, despite all the atrocities that occurred under his watch, he was uh, willing to leave the country and go to Nigeria. So, yes, I think they were just trying to stabilize the country. And eventually, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected as president.
But what led to the resignation of Moses Blah? I'm very curious. Was it? Yeah.
I think he was just an interim leader.
Okay.
And when elections were held, uh, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was educated in the United States as an economist and who was supported by the United States, was backed by Washington to become the head of state after 2005. And she served 2 terms in government
Perfect.
and was able to stabilize the country considerably.
So after the reign of the National Patriotic Party, the country was yes, as you mentioned, it was once more ruled ostensibly by by an independent, the chairman of the transitional government. That leader was Good Bryant of the Liberian Action Party. Apologies if I'm not saying his name correctly. Now he and his party or backed by that party was in office he was in office for 2 years, October 14th, 2003 to January 16th, 2006. Uh, and and is it safe to say that he was also very much to the right, yet another soft right to far right leader before Ellen Johnson came into power.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I mean, most of the governments, just about all the governments that have come to power in Liberia from its inception in 1847 all the way up to the present is heavily pro-American because of the tentacles of U.S. imperialism into the economy and consequently the political structures of the Republic of Liberia. So yes,
So,
I think it's safe to say that just about all of them have been pro-U.S. Sawyer, I think, based upon his role as an activist in Liberia during the 70s and 80s, would probably be considered the most left-leaning of all the leaders that have been in existence there.
well, before I talk about before we talk about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, so is it safe to say that one leader that actually came from, on paper, a left-wing party was a very brief time? Was that the only time? Was it the fact that he actually was sincerely left why he didn't stay in government so long, even as a caretaker one, because that was just too intolerable for the plutocrats of Liberia and their Western backers, namely the U.S. Then,
Yeah, they do not want any type of left-wing, socialist-oriented type government in Liberia, or really anywhere on the African continent. But Liberia, since they have such close ties there, clearly there's a lot of pressure on them to maintain a pro-U.S. position.
so after two bloody civil wars and a tribalistic far right Charles Taylor in power and two others in power for not a long period of time, Liberia finds peace and supposedly stability in the government of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And before she took office, I believe before she took office, she was awarded the Ig Nobel Peace Prize. I'm sorry, the Nobel Peace Prize. And I remember I remember back when I used to watch CNN, BBC, NBC, and even Euronews. This woman was lionized in the global Western corporate press and and Western state media and others that lean to the Western imperial order, depending on whom is the funder in power. Ellen was in power for a whopping 12 years. She was part of the Liberian Action Party. Feminists, including left-wing or left-leaning feminists, propped this woman up. Now, here's where it gets really funny and darkly twisty and darkly twisted. The woman is a right-winger, and I mean very right wing. Her party believes in liberal democracy, economic liberalism, neoliberalism, and in the country ravaged by two bloody wars that has practiced settler colonialism, settler capitalism, and that has implemented black conservatism, and one form of economic liberalism after another, has had horrible crony capitalism and more implemented. Here comes yet another right-wing, right-leaning party. Johnson's Unity Party are members of the International Democracy Union, which is where the global right wing, many center, soft right to far right parties meet to see how they can help one another out and advance a global right agenda. Stephen Harper of the Conservative Party of Canada, former Prime Minister, he is president and chairman of this organization, which was co-founded by Margaret Thatcher. And this organization, yes, a member of the Liberal Party of Australia is in its second in command. So the Unity Party is also a member of the Pan-African right-wing continental branch of this organization, the Democrat Union for Africa. So, all that being said, Abayomi, how do you assess her time in office, January 16, 2006 to January 20th, 2018?
She was instrumental in stabilizing the country, returning some type of order to Liberia, attempting to normalize relations with other countries in the West Africa region. They're members of the Economic Community of West African States. So yes, but still, the poverty remained inside the country, and its political orientation was still towards the West. There was still military cooperation with the United States under AFRICOM, which was formally launched in 2008. So yes, that is the situation that prevailed under her 2 terms of office in Liberia.
Unbelievable. So after Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's time in office ended, she was succeeded by George Weah and his party, Congress for Democratic Change. Now, the politics, according to Wikipedia, is pretty vague. They're described as a big tent party which wants reform, civic nationalism, and populism. Now, often that's a red flag for me. Now, often the term populism is wrongly applied to these new far right movements and these far right xenophobic pro business parties. But how do you assess this government's socioeconomic legacy for the largely working class, working poor, and destitute poor in Liberia?
Weah was a great, well-known soccer player, and because of that,
I didn't know that. It's
he
interesting.
was extremely popular inside the country, and he was also supported heavily by the United States due to his popularity and his pro-Western positions on a lot of issues. Uh, there was no civil war that erupted, but still, problems with poverty and underdevelopment persist even under his term of office.
Now, currently, Liberia is governed once more by the far right neoliberal Unity Party. Its leader and that of the country at the moment is Joseph Boakai. Apologies if I'm not saying his name correctly. What's your assessment of his time in office so far?
Well, he's been battling factionalism within the government. There are elements within the parliament who do not agree with his party and his position on a number of issues. He is clearly pro-West, as most Liberian leaders are. He was vice president under Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And in fact, he came to the United States, I believe it was back in 2009.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
I got a chance to meet him at an event that was sponsored by a well-known Detroit minister. So yes, he is pro-Western, he's pro-U.S., and nonetheless, there are factional problems that are still going on inside of Liberia as well. Now, just recently, it was announced, and hopefully this is not true, but it very well could be true. Well, first of all, he was part of a delegation of West African leaders that came to the United States earlier this year and met with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And was somewhat humorous, but tragic, that he said to President Joseph Boakai that you speak English so well. Did you study English in the United States? So people said he has no idea about the history of Liberia, that English is the official language of the country. The country was set up by the United States during the 1820s and became independent in 1847. So it was just so absurd. Plus, the State Department.
Well, not only that, Donald
Yeah.
Trump and Donald Trump, and I think it's safe to say that the Republican Party, very far right party, you cannot call them a center. Well, whatever that's just such a meaningless term. The Democrats are a center right party. The Republican Party is a far right party, and I just think it's hilarious because Joseph Boakai and Ellen Johnson are the Unity Party is a member of the International Democracy Union, and the Republican Party, Donald Trump's own party, is a member of that global right-wing organization. So it's just hilarious that that he would be unfamiliar with this. As I mentioned before we got cut off, it's funny because Donald Trump's Republican Party is a member of the International Democracy Union, which the Unity Party of Joseph Boakai and Ellen Johnson is. So it's just hilarious that Trump's, far right Republican Party, which is a member of that organization, would not know this about,
Liberia.
about Bukai. So yeah.
Yeah, the
So
thing is, though, the State Department, the U.S. State Department, has laid off so many people, and so they probably don't have people to brief them as in the past. And when they do have foreign guests, to tell them, yeah, this is true about this country, this is not true, so on and so forth. I thought that was very, very interesting that he would say that. But interestingly enough, just recently it came out that Liberia has agreed to take uh, African deportees, but not only Africans, but people from Latin America. And this is a very controversial issue right now in the States and even in West Africa, particularly in Ghana and in Eswatini. This was reported earlier this week in the U.S. Media that they are willing to take Kilmar Obrego Garcia. Now, Kilmar Obrego Garcia had already been detained and illegally deported to El Salvador. And the fact that he was a member, an apprentice with the Sheet Metal Workers Union, they supported his case heavily. Here in Detroit, they showed up at May Day and led the march with a banner calling for the release of Kilmar Obrega Garcia. He was eventually released after a U.S. senator was able to go to El Salvador and meet with him. He was released, but then he's been arrested again. He's been released. Now they were talking about charging him with human trafficking in the state of Tennessee. There's no evidence of that. And also, now they're talking about deporting him to the Republic of Liberia. This was in the media earlier this week. So hopefully Liberia will not accept Kilmar Obrega Garcia and any other migrant that's being deported from the United States, because most of these deportations are illegal.
yeah.
A lot of people have been given protected status in the United States, and even those who haven't, there's still a system of due process that people should be eligible for when they, of course, are deported or threatened with deportation from the United States. So there are at least 5 African countries that I'm aware of that have agreed to accept migrants. South Sudan, for example. There's also Rwanda,
Of course,
Uganda,
Rwanda.
Uganda, which had agreed, but as far as I know, they haven't accepted any yet because they upped their standards that people cannot have any criminal records and a lot of other conditions. Eswatini, for example, the former Kingdom of Swaziland, has taken a number of migrants from the United States. And one Cuban who was deported there is still on a hunger strike, demanding that he be released. Ghana in West Africa, for example, which has such a progressive history, the early phase of its independence struggle and prior to its independence struggle, has the last I saw has accepted 42 migrants from the United States. And there's a lawsuit that was filed here in the United States by a human rights organization against the deportations. And now, inside Ghana itself, a group called Democracy Hub has also filed a lawsuit against the Ghana government saying that the acceptance of these deportees from the United States violates the Ghanaian constitution as well as international law. So hopefully Liberia will not move in that direction. But if they do, there's going to be even more political problems inside the country.
Before we close, let's talk about Liberia's foreign policy. Great segue, actually, to talk about Liberia's foreign policy. So before we close, let's talk about Liberia's foreign policy. What has its relations generally been with Western imperial states led by the U.S. and its allies, Brits and France, Portugal, Spain, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth? And during the Cold War, where was Liberia mostly aligned with? Were they with Western imperial states, or did they try to be non-aligned and have good relations with the USSR, China, Cuba, the Eastern European Communist bloc, Vietnam, Laos, North Korea, or were they mostly tied to the Western evil alliance?
During the Cold War, they were heavily allied with the United States. After World War II, that's when the Cold War really took shape. And countries that were independent, even countries that were not independent, that had independence movements, had to make a choice. Either you allied with the Soviet Union, China, or the Comecon countries in Eastern Europe, or with the United States and those within the European Union and the UK. So yeah, it was pretty much closely allied with U.S. imperialism during the post-World War II period.
Yes, and apparently many of the ruling right-wing, right-leaning parties in Liberia, including or most notably when the True Whig Party was in power during their golden age, they actually supported the creation of Israel. The Unity Party, which is in the same right-wing club, as I mentioned, the IDU, which the Likud Party is a member of, and it's a great example of how so-called center right slash respectable right is merging more and more and making truces and alliances with the fringe and even further far right. So Israel has a good friend in Liberia, apparently on the continent. Uh, and apparently Liberia also supported the U.S.'s war when it on
Vietnam.
Vietnam, as well as the Korean War. So that being said, what is Liberia's relations with some or all of BRICS? Any good historical relations, and one which hopefully will continue unless Western imperialism sabotages it? Very curious your response.
Yeah, I think they will continue to be allied with the West unless there's some type of upheaval in the country, unless during the next elections there's the emergence of a left-wing party which has popular support. That's the only way I see them shifting their position from an alliance with the United States and Britain to a more non-aligned, objectively non-aligned foreign policy, where they would have good relations with the Russian Federation, with the People's Republic of China, and others that are part of the BRICS or the World Socialist camp.
And what's been Liberia's response to the mostly anti French spring that's been happening in its own region of West Africa? I'm curious.
I'm not aware of any response or any efforts to unite with the alliance of Sahel states. So I think they still want to stay out of the problems that have been developing between the former French colonies and Paris. It's a lot that's been going on, particularly in recent months. In Mali, for example, they have, of course, canceled mining contracts with about 90 different entities inside of Mali. In Niger, they have canceled their arrangements with the French government as it relates to the uranium industry. And of course, in Burkina Faso, the tensions are still there as well between France and Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. So we'll have to see how things develop in Liberia. There are, of course, factional problems with other political parties, charges of corruption, and other issues of that nature. So we'll have to see how the current president does. But I believe if he starts collaborating with Trump to a even greater degree, that it could trigger political divisions even more so inside of Liberia, particularly taking illegally deported people from the United States into Liberia where they'll be housed in probably some type of maximum security penal institution, as what has happened in Ghana, as well as what has happened in Eswatini.
And does Liberia, despite being one of the most right-wing, far-right countries in the continent, and despite massive, repression that each, far-right grifter and ruling far-right party has done, does Liberia have a strong left-wing opposition and strong left-wing movements in Liberia that's anti-tribalism and anti-sectarianism and very pan-Africanist leftist? And if the answer is no, then I'm very curious why why would that be the case?
Not since the late 1970s, the early 1980s, when you did have mass demonstrations largely led by youth, and the movement for justice in Africa was involved. Did you have a left-wing oriented movement? Under Talbert, it was still very pro-US. I remember he came to the United States in 1979, and we tried to get in to see him, me and some of my comrades, and they wouldn't let us in. Apparently they were Secret Service agents, perhaps, but this was in 1979. So that gives you an idea of the political character of the government prior to 1980. So yeah, but since that time period, I'm not aware of any strong, I'm sure there are leftists there, of course, and Pan-Africanists, but the fact that they're not strong enough to take power in an election or to bring about a social upheaval that could shift the political trajectory of the country. But Pan-Africanists have been attracted to Liberia. W.B. Du Bois had visited there during his lifetime. Garvey attempted to form some type of alliance with the Liberian government, did not work out. And so it's quite interesting to see these. And also I mentioned Amy Ashwood Garvey, who spent a considerable amount of time there during the period of the 1940s and 1950s.
Then I have to ask this question. What was Frederick Douglass's assessment of how Liberia became what it was, and that of W.E.B. Du Bois? And we have to plug this woman's book. Margaret Kimberly, the senior executive editor of Black Agenda Reports. I was shocked, in her book, Prejudicial Black America and Its Presidents, that Abraham Lincoln, who's often seen as the wonderful white liberal who freed our people from slavery and went to war and so forth, he still believed in settler colonialism and manifest destiny, but apparently he was very supportive of once the slaves are free, send them to Liberia.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a big debate in this country. The abolitionist movement, most of them were opposed to colonization because they saw it as a way of avoiding the question of the abolition of enslavement of African people. So, and a lot of Black people were opposed to colonization as well. And Douglass was one of them, but there were others. Now, Martin Delany, who had also fought in the Civil War, became a proponent of migration. So, it was a split in the community. Most of the white abolitionists were opposed to it, but in the early years, there were abolitionists that did support the formation of Liberia and were part of the American Colonization Society. So it was a mixed bag. In the ACS, you had very wealthy, prominent white individuals. You had African Americans who felt that there was no future, secure, democratic future for them inside the United States. And then, of course, there were some abolitionists that supported it as well. But by and large, the abolitionist movement, as well as many elements within the African community inside the United States, were opposed to the American Colonization Society.
And wasn't Frederick Douglass? Didn't he write many times and made many speeches where he lamented what Liberia ended up becoming? That it basically became, uh, you know, black
A
capital,
colony. Yeah.
black capitalism, and freed black people practicing a form of slavery and exploitation on their own indigenous black people. So he was quite disgusted at what Liberia ended up becoming. Correct.
Yes, and I think that also what's important is that even the elites there still were subjected to capitalist domination, whether it was from the US government directly or from multinational corporations that were based in the United States, particularly Firestone Rubber Company, which was closely allied with the automotive industry and Ford Motor Company.
And what was W.E.B. Du Bois's assessment of what became of Liberia and how Liberia became the country it was? I The research I did, apparently he was quite uh, reluctant to criticize Liberia because he thought that this should that because he thought that it could still be a model of what a freed African society was like. But apparently, towards the end of his life, he started to lament what became Liberia, and certainly did not want that model of liberation for Black people globally. Correct.
Yes, and in a speech that I recall hearing, the situation in the 1950s shifted to the national liberation movements. And Ghana, for example, uh, was the most left wing during this particular time period. And Du Bois was a strong supporter of Kwame Nkrumah. So was his wife, his second wife, Shirley Graham Du Bois. And they, in fact, went there to live. Um, W.B. Du Bois died there in 1963. And Shirley Graham Du Bois remained there until the military coup d'etat that was backed by the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department took over. And she had to leave the country in 1966 because she was being held under house arrest.
Oh,
They viewed her as
Ghana,
being
you mean? Ghana, you mean? She had
in
to.
Ghana, right?
Okay, okay, yeah.
So they supported the progressive uh, national liberation movements, independence parties, and were critical of the whole process that was taking place in Liberia.
And uh, and then I have to ask this question. So, given the late American Jamaican Marcus Garvey, he advocated that Black Americans and others in the Afro descendant diaspora give up on the U.S. and move back to Africa. And Garvey, there still is a lot of debates around him, but from my assessment, from at least some of the research I've done, I believe it's safe to say that he was fairly right leaning and very much believed in black capitalism. So that being said, does Liberia show that connecting all African peoples means nothing if it's not a socialist project? And given that Liberia, this is one of the oldest African nations, I'm curious, do you think Liberia shows that black capitalism slash African capitalism, especially if you are a diehard right winger, simply doesn't work? And actually answer that first before I ask my last two questions.
Yeah, it does not work. And Liberia is a good example from the mid 19th century all the way up to the present. It has struggled with huge debt, internal political conflict. So, no, you have to move towards a non capitalist path of development to socialist orientation, to outright socialism. That is the only real solution that will solve the problems of the African continent.
And so, and that being said, what's your assessment? Just any final words. What's your assessment of the tragedy of Liberia, and again, why Pan Africanist leftism is the only way forward, not just for that country, but the continent of Africa as a whole.
Yeah, I think the assessment related to Liberia is that there is no solution under capitalism, which is totally dominated by the United States. So, in that regard, I think it provides a case study on post independence Africa. They got a head start of more than 100 years, 1847 all the way up to what, 1922, when Egypt was given nominal independence, and Libya in 1951, um, Sudan in 1956, and the Gold Coast in 1957. So you have to move beyond just flag independence. What has to take place is that an economy has to be established, a political system has to be established which recognizes and promotes the interests of the overwhelming majority of people inside of a country, that being the workers, the farmers, and the youth. And until Africa can develop organizations that can seize power, that will empower those sectors of the population, it will remain underdeveloped and consequently subjected to U.S. domination.
Just before we close, I have to ask this bonus question. Tanzania has been in the has been in the news, and I'm a little bit afraid of some of the coverage that some of our left leaning outlets have been covering. People's Dispatches and the World Socialist websites are all kind of recycling that this sort of tyrannical government. And this is a people power revolution that's being that's fighting against big bad government. Uh, what's your assessment of the protest that's happening in Tanzania? And do you think, before we start saying we side with the protests, do you think that this is another color revolution and that we should not be too enthusiastic about the people protesting, and that this could and that even if there are legitimate grievances, that this could
Right.
very quickly turn into a Western imperial project, Western color revolution? Very, very, very curious.
Yes, I support the Chama Cha Mapinduzi, which was formerly the Tanzanian African National Union, well, Tanganyika African National Union, then later the Tanzanian African National Union, which was formed by Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, who was a socialist and a Pan-Africanist. So yes, I think there are elements there that are supported by the West. They want to destabilize Tanzania and its ruling party, the CCM. We saw a similar situation earlier, a few months ago, in Mozambique, where the Frelimo party was being challenged, and there were also violent disturbances inside the country. So we have to keep an eye on all of these developments, because even though Tanzania is considered now a mixed economy, but it does have a revolutionary history. It supported the national independence movements of the 1950s through the 1990s. So I believe that there are efforts to destabilize Tanzania, and that in terms of progressive politics, I think that the CCM is the best prospect for the future of Tanzania, the United Republic of Tanzania.
And both Bangladesh and Nepal are just two great examples. Nepal was under a communist government, which has essentially been overthrown, and there were so many leftists, even communists and people who usually lionize China and see nothing wrong with China, who were supporting the ouster of this Maoist governments and well, I think it's very quickly turning into a neoliberal hellhole. And in Bangladesh, even though they're great example, the students they were protesting for legit for very legitimate grievances, but now under Mohammed Yunus and so forth, and co-opted by the West,
Yes.
the very things that that they're protesting about are not being addressed, and it's very and it's just so obvious that yet another Western imperial policies are being advanced. So I would say to folks, don't get up and be like we're on the side of the Tanzanian protest when it's like, guys,
Yeah.
y'all should
What
know
do these
better.
people stand for? What is their history? And what is their political program? I know in Bangladesh, um, there was people that were championing what happened, but Sheikh Hasina had taken some measures that the United States did not like. And I don't know what's going on there now, whether it's going to improve the situation or not. But we have to be very careful when we see these uprisings taking place in countries, even countries that are considered right wing or centrist. In
Exactly.
many cases, the U.S. wants to destabilize them as well, so they can put puppets in, a new puppet, ostensibly to revitalize their neo-colonial domination inside the country.
Exactly. Well, we were joined on this epic edition of One Plus One, learning all about the history and current affairs of Liberia with our always wonderful returning champion, historian, journalist, and Pan Africanist leftist, and all round anti imperialist and support of all people power movements, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports. Check out his work and all of his appearances on One Plus One, and subscribe to Pan African Newswire and Bar. Donate generously to them, and don't forget to do the same for One Plus One. Donate to us, please, and share widely all of One Plus One's content and encourage others to like us and again share and donate. The next country we'll be exploring is Sierra Leone. Join us next week for that. And just before we close, rest in peace to Sam Rivers, the longtime bass player of Limp Bizkit, forever immortal with his music. My condolences to his family and friends and the band of Limp Bizkit. And all my best to everyone. Good night and good luck. And see you then.